the Roundtable is a coalition of over 100 organizations working in Washington on federal criminal justice policy reform. The nitty-gritty of the Roundtable is its working groups, and that's where strategy is discussed, brainstorming is done, and we can really get down in the weeds. And that's the lifeblood of the Justice Roundtable. For the Roundtable, it's more general public gatherings for those who aren't necessarily enmeshed in the day-to-day work of the working groups, can still get a feel for what is happening and what is going on. The Justice Roundtable was the catalyst behind the passage of the Second Chance Act in 2008. Sentencing Reform Working Group helped to usher in the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And our Commutations and Pardons Working Group worked very closely with respect to the Obama-era clemency initiative, which resulted in the release from unjust incarceration of over 1,700 people.
The fact that we have come together this evening, brought together, we got the call from the Justice Roundtable and we all responded. And it couldn't be a more critical and important time for us to share an evening like this, but be together under one roof, reminded that we are all in this together.
I would like to welcome everyone to the Justice Roundtable. This is our 75th Justice Roundtable Assembly. Can you believe it? We started in 2002, and I'm proud to say that we have not missed an assembly in our 19 years of existence. My name is Nkechi Taifa, and I've convened the Justice Roundtable along with my colleague Jean Guerrero since its inception. On June 17, 1971, President Nixon stood in front of the White House press corps and made his historic declaration of a new type of war. Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse, he said. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it's necessary to wage a new all-out offense, a war on drugs. And now, 50 years later, the war on drugs has left a trail of disruption. People of color have been targeted and disproportionately subjected to mass incarceration for drug offenses, devastating families, devastating communities. People of color, communities across this country, they are ready right now to end the war on drugs. People are embracing harm reduction, are advocating the shifting of resources from enforcement to treatment, legalizing marijuana, and more. Today's Justice Roundtable Assembly will consist of two panels. One, a look back to the past by people who lived it. And panel two, a look forward by Justice Roundtable Working Group leaders. Before our panels, I'm thrilled that we are joined by the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Chair of the House Crime Subcommittee, a long-standing leader in this battle, who will provide a few remarks of reflection on the war on drugs and what we must do today. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, esteemed chair of the House Judiciary Committee on Crime, long-standing leader on so very many critical justice issues. Welcome to the June 2nd, 2021 General Assembly of the Justice Roundtable Coalition. It is almost unbelievable, Congresswoman, that we are fast approaching the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs, that proclamation by President Nixon. And I would like to know if you could just provide our roundtable with just a bit of reflection that you might have about the war on drugs and just what we should be doing today.
So good to be with you. Thank you so very much for having me. This has been a long journey. It's a moment in time where you really want to just reflect and pause of how wrong we can be. And as Dr. King has indicated, and many others, when there's a wrong, you need to right it. I'm holding in my hand, I just had to pull up, do a little research. It's been a long journey for me. I've been in the United States Congress now for 2 decades plus, and we've been fighting against mandatory minimums and the idea of using drugs as a sledgehammer against Black people and people of color and poor people across America. And so just about 7 to 10 days before President Obama was sworn in, January 7th, 2009, I introduced the one-to-one, the one-to-one. And I really fought hard for that. It was called the Drug Sentencing Reform and Cocaine Kingpin Trafficking Act. And as you well know, during that process, many of you know, we were engaged very heavily during President Obama's tenure, and many offerings were offered, and ultimately we signed a bill 8-1. I still believe 1-1. So when I reflect over these 50 years, I believe it is time to right the wrong. And even when a bill was being done under Republican leadership, it was a bill that dealt with finally the recognition, if you will, that drugs are an addiction, it's a sickness. And they were dealing with opioids. And I insisted to add language in that bill, insisted in the waning hours, because it was a long, long time being done. I insisted that we add in there that crack cocaine, the crack in particular, should also be considered an addiction and a health crisis. And that is the fight that we continue to have. It's hard to imagine that we have now experienced 5 decades of the failed war on drugs, whose destructive policies have fueled over-criminalization and mass incarceration, destabilized generations of families, proliferated the rise of youth and women of color in the system, and resulted in a regime of collateral consequences, negatively impacting everything from employment, housing, public benefits, education, and the franchise, to name a few. That's right, people evicted from homes because there are provisions that disallow people who've had felonies, mostly dealing with drugs, to be able to have public housing or other housing, private housing, where that's a question that is asked by the landlord. In essence, the war on drugs, a war on Black people and people of color and their communities, it is past time that it is ended. 50 years should be a catapult and energy for us to say never again, and not on our watch. I came to Congress shortly after the crime bill of 1994 was passed. Excesses from that and previous omnibus crime bills included mandatory minimum sentencing schemes, 3-strike laws, elimination of Pell educational grants to prisoners, the trying of 13-year-old children as adults, and more. In my committee, we're going head on. Soon we'll be holding a major sentencing reform hearing. And from there, we will tackle mandatory minimums, the disparities with crack cocaine still. And yes, my bill 1-1 will be presented along with other members who have gravitated toward the idea of 1-1. I participated in the early debates on the crack powder disparity and worked hard to get what was ultimately known as the Fair Sentencing Act passed. That is the legislation that President Obama signed, and we're grateful at that time for what we could get, 1-8, 8-1. We're still trying to come out from under that harsh, tough on crime regime. In 2003 or 2003, I co-sponsored a congressional briefing on a scandal which occurred in my home state of Texas, where 15% of the Black population of the small town of Collier in 1999 was arrested. There were many of you who worked with me on that, including lawyers. They were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned on drug trafficking charges. Mothers with children, incarcerated, dads, senior citizens. Despite trials and pleas marred by serious due process violations, the convictions were based on the sole uncorroborated testimony of a white narcotics officer with a racist background whose modus operandi was to record purported drug buys on his arms and legs. You've got to right the wrong. The undercover officer was part of a federally funded narcotics task force where police departments, sheriff officers, and district attorneys combined their efforts, resulting in overzealous measures to so-called fight drugs. How unfortunate. They ultimately found out about this corrupt officer, and some of these cases were ultimately reviewed and overturned, but the hurt and the harm was there. We must continue to respond to these horrific abuses, but you know what? As we go forward, we must not have these horrific abuses. We must not have these guidelines. That is not criminal justice, it is criminal injustice. This is precisely why I've introduced, supported, and continue to work on numerous legislation, including the No More Tulias Act, to, among other things, require corroborating evidence in federally funded drug convictions and require screening of law enforcement officers or others acting in the color of law participating in drug task force. We're going to push, and we ask your support of that legislation to see whether we can move that in this time when we want to right the wrong. The Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level, reassessing marijuana convictions and investing in local communities. And the Drug Sentencing Reform and Cocaine Kingpin Trafficking Act, the one that I've just discussed, to eliminate the unjust and discriminatory 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences in federal law, and which was incorporated in the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 that President Obama signed into law, which I mentioned, which ultimately was the 8-to-1. Let's keep pushing for 1-to-1. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which in part of its comprehensive approach to hold police accountable, change the culture of law enforcement, provide trust and transparency, empower our communities, build trust between law enforcement, promote the good police, they exist, and our communities by addressing systemic racism, institutional racism, and bias to help save lives, to turn lives around, to right the wrong. Bans no knocks in drug cases at the federal level and conditions law enforcement funding for state and local governments, banning no knock warrants at the local and state level. As I said, this is a ground foundation, but there has to be more. Now, as chair of the subcommittee, I look forward to working with organizations of the Justice Roundtable, all of you who have been such stalwarts, nonstop, unceasing, determined, persistent, and others to advance the hard issues that help bring about true systemic change. The time is ripe for a serious look at eliminating mandatory minimums for drug offenses. The time is right for correcting the excesses of the Crime Bill of 1994, and we don't have a lot of time. There is a sense of urgency. The time is right for a second look at the inordinately lengthy prison terms of now elderly people who will no longer have access to the courts. The time is right for not just criminal justice reform, but transformation. The streets are demanding it. Now we in the suites must make it happen. No, this is not about HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals, but in that we know that such disparities as the criminal justice system will be found. But what we have to do now is to take the system that we have and right the wrong. I thank the Justice Roundtable for, as I said, its persistence, its innovation, its commitment, its passion. If these incarcerated persons and their families have no voice, then where are we? So I thank you again for your and their continued vigorous fight around these issues and for being a partner as we in Congress look to do our part to address the adverse impacts of policies derived from the war on drugs era. Again, thank you for your grand leadership, and we must right the wrong. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Right the wrong. Justice is in our hands.
Thank you so very much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. You are absolutely correct. We must right the wrong, and we that are part of the Justice Roundtable want to help you right those wrongs. We want to help you tackle these issues. The time is now. Thank you so very much for your leadership. We stand with you.
Thank you so very much. Together we will win.
Again, thank you so very much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. The Justice Roundtable, as always, will work with you side by side to make sure that we pass policies that are just and fair. So, folks, I was recently cruising through the internet and I came across an historic video of Lawrence Garrison, son of Queen Karen Garrison, the mommy activist, twin brother of Lamont Garrison. And Lawrence was speaking as part of a panel in June of 2011 on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the war on drugs. And Lawrence had recently been released from years of unjust imprisonment. His brother was still in prison at the time. Lawrence, unfortunately, is no longer with us on this earthly plane, but I would like to share the video of his remarks with you at this time in his loving memory. And as the video is being keyed up for sharing, I'd like to invite any of you to place any words of remembrance that you may have of Lawrence Garrison in the chat box. So the video featuring Lawrence Garrison will start momentarily.
Thank you so much for inviting me here to share my story about my brother and I. We grew up here in Washington, D.C., Trinidad Avenue, Trinidad neighborhood. And we went to local high schools in Kinley Tech. We graduated from Howard University, bachelor's political science. May 1998 was a special month for us because we graduated, but at the same time, we were facing a fight. We unfortunately succumbed to false allegations of a conspiracy in the Eastern District of Virginia. We were tried, convicted, and sentenced in the Eastern District, which is known as the Rocket Docket. My brother was sentenced to 235 months. I was sentenced to 188 months, 15 years and 8 months. My brother, 19 years and 8 months. My brother got an additional 46 months for testifying to our defense at trial. Now, I've presumed my innocence for these 13 years. I served 11 years and 8 months. My brother is currently still serving his sentence. And it's, first I'd like to thank my mother, Karen Garrison, Santa. Will get me home 36 months earlier, and my brother 46 months earlier. I'd like to thank Nkechi, Taifa, Gotsch, all these people supported my mother. And I really want to thank her because I wouldn't be standing here without her. And a lot of other people should be thanking her because she stood up with FAM, other organizations, every time they asked her to tell our story. We did interviews. Since I've been home, I've done this several times, but back to the story. We succumbed to someone's allegations, and it's really, really hard to stand up in front of you and go back to those things. I'm trying to put those things behind me, but I got to tell my story to help others. Yeah. So the people that I left behind, I can't forget them. Can't forget them. The thing is, now we're on the door of hopefully another retroactivity amendment, 1801, that can help other people. And I use my story to help others. So now I'm glad they use my brother and I's story. I know why I went through this, to help others. It wasn't about if it was right or wrong. It wasn't about that. And still not. This system is not about right or wrong. It's about money. It's about counting bodies. And sadly to say, it's African-American bodies. And, we're the minority in this country, but we're the majority in prison. And it's hard. And every day I got to wake up and face that my brother's not here. And I got to look at my mother with my brother not being here. It's still hard. But, the unjust things that have happened have pushed me forward. Right. And help. My mother and I have a radio show, Blog Talk Radio, 6:30 Sunday. You can get on it online, and we talk about these issues. We give legal help to others that are going through families. We support them, do anything we can as far as advice. But going back to my story, after my brother and I were sentenced in the Eastern District of Virginia, we were separated in prison. We were never allowed to be together. I've always been with my brother every minute of my life. So that was the toughest thing, being separated from my brother. But be able to talk to my mom every day and tell her, I love her on the phone every day mattered. And she told me every day was one day closer. And it was. We looked around in January 19, 2009, I was in a halfway house here. And she got me there, So and there's countless articles and things we've done. You can Google my mother's name or my name, Garrison twins, and you can see our story. But today I was trying to reach back and help those people that are not getting help. They don't have what my brother and I had. They didn't have family. They didn't have a support team to get home. When I got home, to help me get a job, help me get clothes, things like that. So it was really hard to leave my brother and to leave other men and women behind. It's really tough, But I'm glad, I'm here to tell this story today. And I live to tell this story today, because prison is not easy. It's physically, mentally challenging and spiritually challenging. Every minute of the day they're breaking, every minute. I worked in a computer factory where we rebuilt computers every day. So 8 hours a day for 20 cents an hour, we rebuilt computers. This factory made $110,000 a month off the sweat of black men's backs. So it's just the reality of it. But I can remember, telling those guards that this ain't my life, it's yours. Right. It's not mine, and it's gonna come to an end. One day it's gonna come to an end. So every day was one day closer. And I'm standing here today to tell you this story. Yes, so I can look at anybody in the face and tell them, I didn't do this. These were false allegations. Somebody that got themselves out of trouble. And they call it a snitch culture. That's what it is. It's get down first. Whoever can get down first and get out of jail first. So that's a hell of a momentum to keep this wheel keep going and to keep people lying and telling stories. There's guilty people in prison, but they don't deserve 10, 15 years on their first offense for 1 gram of crack. Right. There's no way that they deserve that. But the thing is, I met so many people that were like my brother and I, professionals, not criminals. The guy that made a mistake, used drugs, or lost his job and took a chance one time, not 10 times, not for 15, 20 years, but one time, and made a mistake and got 20, 30 years for crack, and get pumped up in trial, and they turn it into 30 or 40 keys, and for 2 keys of crack, get your life in jail. And it's sad. I started out in Underwood, FCI, and I started out seeing brothers just like my brother now, same age. I was 25 when I went to jail, but I seen guys with life sentences. Life sentence, they didn't kill nobody. Life sentences. The average sentence when we went there was 15 years, and the average person was 21 years old, and they was African American. I don't have to read a book, you don't have to read a paper. You're looking at it right there. You're looking at the result of it right here, every day. So here I am again to tell my story, and soon my brother will be right beside me to tell his story. So it's hard because a lot of you will hopefully never go through what I went through. But it's hard to convince a jury that's not of your peers that you didn't do it. They took my brother down to Alexandria, Virginia. I'm from Washington, D.C., Northeast Washington. They took me to Alexandria, Virginia, ex-sheriffs, ex-CIA, ex-DA was on my trial. So what do you think they were going to do? They won't convict us. 2 young black men. They didn't care if we went to Howard University. They don't care if Alvin Thornton came up there and testified for us. The head of political science at Howard University at the time. They looked at him just like what he was, a black man. They didn't care. They didn't care about no credentials or anything. They wanted to send 2 black men to prison that day, and they did. My brother and I was sentenced on October 16, 1998. And after that, we were split up. During my incarceration, I helped others. I did legal work. It was really surprising me how many people were functionally illiterate. They couldn't write a letter to their family members. They didn't even know what they got charged with. They couldn't even read their charges. They didn't even, a lot of them were never diagnosed with dyslexia. They didn't even know what it was. but I was there to help them. And I'm glad I was there at that time to help them, because somebody always has it worse than you, always. So, I was thankful. I thank God every day that I was able to wake up and lay down every morning. Every night, but it was important that I was there. After being in after that first 5 years, and my brother and I fighting, get to our 2255, and the judge kept that in front of him 5 years to give us a decision to deny us, and my mother told me every day, hey, I can't do this time for you, but I'm with you. She said, you got to stand up and fight for something or lay down for anything. And I did. When I went to trial, I fought like a man, because I knew that I was going to get convicted. We knew. They weren't going to give us a proper jury. They weren't going to do it. There's no such thing in Eastern District of Virginia. There's no such thing. But anyway, I don't want to take up no more time. Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me up.
Wow. That was absolutely heart-wrenching. Just looking and listening to Lawrence Garrison's testimony. And Karen Garrison, Mommy Activist, I hope you're saving the chat so that you can see all of the tributes and remarks that people have been making in the chat about Lawrence. But at this time, we're going to bring up our first panel. And the Justice Roundtable always wanted to make sure that the human face was highlighted. That's the only way the Second Chance Act of 2008 was passed. That's the only way the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 was passed, because we helped to bring partners within the roundtable, helped to bring human faces to the fore. And Lawrence Garrison was one of those human faces. And we're going to see some more as well. So I'm going to see if I can bring up our first panel. Our first panel is called The Look Back, okay? And we are featuring Karen Garrison, and I'm going to see if I can just add spotlight. We're going to be featuring Eric Sterling. Let's try to add spotlight. Hope I'm doing this right. We're going to feature Marc Maurer. Let's see where he is. Okay, here he is, right here. Add spotlight, and we are featuring Kemba Smith. Here she is. Add spotlight, and we are featuring William Underwood. Okay, add spotlight. Okay, welcome panel. Panel one. So I would like for each of you all to briefly discuss in about 3 to 5 minutes just what your specific vantage point was with respect to involvement in the war on drugs, just how that came about and why. And I want to begin with Queen Karen Garrison, the mother of Lawrence that we just saw on the historic video clip. Karen, in about 3 to 5 minutes, if you could just tell us your perspective on the war on drugs from the vantage point in which you were engaged. I know you started out not as mommy activist, you started out as a cosmetologist. So let us hear just briefly from your vantage point, your journey.
Well, from my vantage point was I was a mother that sons went to school, never missed a day at home. They were good boys, as I say, BOYZ, good boys, and they took advantage of school. They went to public school and everything, and had goals and dreams and aspirations. And at that day when they said guilty in the courtroom, I didn't know what to do. I lost my breath for a moment. And then I blurted out some profanity, of course, and on the way home, I knew I had to do something, but your wheels in your mind keep turning. They're turning all along, like, what happened? What happened? They didn't even know the people there. And I'm thinking that, I've had a bout with the criminal justice system, but I was guilty. And I'm looking now, what can I do? And from that point on, I knew I had to fight. I started to stop looking at the, being a professional hair designer, I looked at the fashion part of the newspaper. I got the paper every day, but I looked at the fashion to keep up with things for my clients, to be on top of that game. I had to put that down and start watching the news and doing things that, were more political and talking about more criminal justice issues. And the ball just got to rolling. My vantage point was that I knew nothing. So I could hear a lot of things. That was it for me. And then common sense always rolled in. This doesn't make sense. So I started to go places and talk about it to people. And my son started to give me more inside information. And that was my vantage point also, advantage of getting the news from inside. Because then I realized there were so many people that were talking about these issues that were just talking about what they heard. It was like when I think at One Justice Roundtable, I announced it's not acceptable anymore to talk about us without us, because we have articulate Black men and women, youth as well, that can speak on their situations. And so my vantage point became something to deal with, and I feel that in all this time being, I went to speak everywhere I was invited. I had the idea of to get in where you fit in. But then after a while, it's not getting in where you fit in. It's taking a lane, utilizing it, coming to intersections. Like I have my radio show, and Lawrence announced it. That was in 2009. We called it On My Way Home, but I had been doing it a while before he came home, and it began to roll because I know that news, information, resources, and hand in hand conversations were the thing that you needed. And I always let everybody know that my sons, were twin boys and all the things, Washington, D.C. I started to get media attention. I started to get it. I rolled it out. I had a packet. I did what I had to do to get the word out. And that was my thing, not being afraid or ashamed to tell what has happened to me. And that's how I ran up on the job that I ran up on. I ran up on all of you, Nkechi, Taifa, Jesslyn McCurdy, Zerlene Hughes, Spurrell now, and Angela Frazier Giles. And then there were some great people on this panel as well. Eric Sterling, Marc Mallon. I'll never forget Marc because he kept a relationship with the boys I didn't even know, and he never even mentioned it. But there are so many people to mention. But I got an opportunity to participate. And that was from the conservative side, where I worked for an organization that allowed me to keep that Blackness alive, because it was necessary. And I'm gonna stop here. Anything else we can talk about another time, but thank you so much for the comments in the chat. My heart goes out for them that still have to fight, for us that still fight, because it should be no more without us. Without us at all. And for the Andrea James, I'm not going to forget her. She's a bad girl working in every aspect to make get people free and give them pride. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Karen. Queen Karen Garrison, mommy activist. We love you always and forever. Thank you. I want to turn next to Eric. Eric Sterling, oh my goodness. You were in Congress at the time. You were a congressional staffer counsel to the House Judiciary Committee from 1979 to 1989. Can you talk to us briefly about the role you played back then, what you've been doing since then to try to ameliorate any harms that might have been caused back then? Let us know from your vantage point, Eric Sterling.
Thanks, Nkechi. I'm really honored to be on this panel and to be part of the Justice Roundtable. As I look back, I see a lot of lows and highs. To stay in time, I had written out my observations. It begins for me out of law school in 1976 when I was a public defender. As I look back, I see how I spent 3 years helping men and women with substance use disorders, histories of abuse and neglect, disabilities, plead guilty. That was, of course, what, as a public defender, was the outcome in the overwhelming majority of my cases. Defendants impoverished, disproportionately Black and Hispanic. The office provided no training for the young attorneys and little support. When I protested the excessive caseload, my boss threatened to fire me. My boss did approve my plan to open a public defender office inside the county prison to better represent our clients. I spent a half year working then behind bars. Simultaneously, I was the county's ACLU volunteer counsel, and I ran the county chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML. As an active Quaker, I successfully initiated an effort that got Philadelphia Quakers to endorse marijuana decriminalization in 1978. In 1979, I was hired by the House Judiciary Committee. Because of my interest in drugs, I acquired the drugs portfolio. In 1981, the drugs jurisdiction was transferred to the House Crime Subcommittee under Representative William J. Hughes of New Jersey, and I was transferred to, and I became the attorney for the war on drugs for the House Judiciary Committee. I also had responsibility for gun control, money laundering, organized crime, and pornography. Hughes was a great boss. He was honest, very intelligent, hardworking, well organized, and always appreciative. And it was a very exciting job. I helped Hughes co-sponsor medical marijuana legislation in 1982. In the fall of '84, I helped him support the Compassionate Pain Relief Act to legalize heroin for medical use, which was voted down on the House floor. I was involved in the drugs provisions of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. I remember at one point in the mid-'80s, I delivered a memo to Chairman Hughes, encouraging him to support, if not lead, an effort to decriminalize marijuana. He told me that that position would assure his re-election defeat. I was centrally involved in writing many provisions of the notorious Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which I've highlighted here in yellow from the first page of the public law. Most tragically and most notoriously, I was centrally involved in writing the mandatory minimum drug sentencing that used the small quantities of drugs to trigger the long sentences, such as 5 grams of crack getting up to 40 years and 50 grams of crack getting up to life imprisonment. This was part of the 100-to-1 crack powder disparity. In the 35 years since, due to the Department of Justice's eager and profoundly misguided application of that law, hundreds of thousands of men and women, predominantly BIPOC, just like Lawrence and Lamont Garrison, have served prison terms decades longer than most observers considered just. And the mandatory minimums also encouraged snitching and plea bargaining and perjury that also led to the kinds of unjust convictions in Lawrence and Lamont's cases. Most judges who comment on these sentences adamantly condemn them. In the words of the Fifth Circuit District Judges Association in May 1991, they are, quote, often manifestly unjust. The Fifth Circuit judges are the judges from places like Texas, Mississippi. In 1984, I played a central role in the Emergency Scheduling Act used by DEA to ban ecstasy. I helped write the Analog Act in '86. However, I discreetly helped the psychiatrists who were treating patients who were using MDMA in their field to find a therapist, to find a lobbyist, excuse me. Whenever it would not violate a confidence, I regularly provided information that came to my attention to NORML and to High Times magazine about federal activities and documents they would not become aware of. In 1986, I became one of the first members of the Drug Policy Foundation, which since became the Drug Policy Alliance. In 1989, I was able to leave the Judiciary Committee and started the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation to legalize drugs and end the war on drugs. I helped start the Marijuana Policy Project, the Interfaith Drug Policy Initiative, Forfeiture Endangers American Rights, the Justice Roundtable, and other organizations. In 1990, I organized the meetings that led to the creation of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, FAM, which started in my office in 1991. I was its first funder and original member of its board of directors, and a position I still hold. I was so proud to be part of the start of the Justice Roundtable and their campaign to repeal mandatory minimum crack sentences. The bill that Congresswoman Jackson Lee mentioned, the Cocaine Kingpin Act, I'm actually the author of that act back in 2007. And it was introduced by her in December of 2007 and co-sponsored with very, very distinguished members from the House. It was then introduced in the Senate by Senator Joe Biden and later co-sponsored by Senators Obama and Clinton. And it led to in the next Congress, the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act. I've testified before many state legislatures repeatedly. I supported Students for Sensible Drug Policy since 2000 and served on their board. I've been able to be in state and local government positions. That DC Mayor Marion Barry, I was on his advisory commission on drug abuse. Baltimore Mayor Kirk Schmoke's advisory committee. In Montgomery County, Maryland, the Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Advisory Council. The State of Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission. Currently, I'm on the Montgomery County Policing Advisory Commission. For 45 years, I fought against the war on drugs, and for 9 years from on the inside. And I've been blessed to have many people I've been able to mentor and advise, and I'm still at it. And I'm grateful for this opportunity, Nkechi. Thank you.
Eric, you're definitely still at it in the role that you have played with respect to the Justice Roundtable has been immeasurable. So thank you very much. I remember all the very many strategy sessions. I remember you sitting me down and getting that ratio thing straight in my mind. So again, thank you very much. And we're going to move on right now. We're going to hear now from Marc Maurer. And Marc, you were either a part of or at the helm, okay, of the sentencing project for years, for decades, okay, until your recent retirement. Can you just tell us about your vantage point with respect to the war on drugs and your reflection with respect to this 50-year history? Marc Maurer.
Sure. Well, Nkechi, thanks so much for having me here. And it's a real treat to be here with my friends and colleagues on the screen. We share lots of experiences together. So my work around the war on drugs and war on crime has largely been focused on challenging the sentencing severity, sentencing enhancements that came along with all of those measures. And I want to talk just about one moment in the war on drugs experience that I think illustrates a lot of what we're talking about. That was the infamous 1994 crime bill in Congress, which was largely devoted to funding for police and prisons, and included the notorious 3 strikes and you're out policy. The 3 strikes policy was very much promoted by President Clinton at the time. In his State of the Union address that year, he talked about the need for 3 strikes, modeled after similar legislation been adopted in Washington State and California. And so came a moment when the House Judiciary Committee convened a hearing in conjunction with the crime bill on the 3 strikes policy. I was invited to testify in one of the panels, was pleased to do so. So the day of the hearing, we had a packed committee hearing room. There were loads of TV cameras there covering the hearing. The first panel up consisted of 6 family members of victims of serious violent crime. Some cases were murder, other cases, other serious violent crimes. And they testified about their experiences, the crimes, and their family members. And of course, it was very disturbing, very sad to hear their stories. But as we looked at the members there, for a start, all 6 of them were white family members. Here we had members of Congress who allegedly had been concerned about crime in the Black community, and apparently they're unable to find a single Black representative who had suffered from a serious violent crime to hear their perspective. All 6 of the crimes that were committed had been state crimes, not federal, so they were less relevant to the issue at hand. And perhaps most disturbing was after they had testified, members of Congress on the panel began asking the family members for their views on the 3 strikes sentencing policy and what sentencing policy would have been appropriate to help in their case. Now, I think it's important to have the voices of victims of crime involved in the discussion about crime and sentencing policy, broadly speaking, but they don't come to us as experts on sentencing policy. They're not familiar with the courts. They're not familiar with research on sentencing. They're not judges who have experience with it. So of course, the members of Congress said, do you think this is a good idea? And it was not surprising. They said, yes, we do need a 3 strikes policy. Okay, so after that, there was a panel and there was a representative from the Department of Justice presenting data on the federal prison population. And then Congressman Bobby Scott asked a very probing and insightful question. He asked, can you tell us how many 4 strikes cases there are in federal prison right now? So essentially what he was saying was, all right, are there people who've committed 3 strikes offenses for serious violent or drug crimes who have gotten out after the 3rd strike and yet committed a 4th strike after that? You know, if there are hundreds or thousands of them, maybe that would argue for having a 3 strikes policy so they'd never get out. Well, the Justice Department representative said he didn't know how many there were. He'd get back to the committee. I don't know whether he did or not. So there was that. And then by the afternoon, my panel came on. By then, of course, the TV cameras had gone and there were fewer members on the panel. I and my colleagues talked about the fact that there already was no shortage of stiff federal penalties available if somebody really required that, according to a judge, that people age out of crime. The person who commits a serious violent crime at 25 is not the same public safety threat at 45, and the racial disparities that go along with that sentencing. Well, today, lots of people who were there at the time supporting this have now expressed certain regret. Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, other leaders at the time say that the bill went too far, is how they often describe it. It went too far because of their concern about crime. And if you think about it, you know, I knew that the bill went too far at the time, and others on the screen here and many in the audience knew that too. And we didn't know it because we had access to data that the members of Congress didn't have. We didn't know it because we had research that they didn't have access to. We knew it because of evidence, and they had access to the same evidence. And clearly, for political reasons, emotional reasons, and the political environment, that's why they supported it then. So it's good that we're getting to a point today where we're talking about justice, we're talking about evidence-based policy and the like, and hopefully we can learn from those tragedies of the past political environment to not repeat that and to continue the momentum for a more fair and compassionate system. Thanks so much, Nkechi.
Marc, our sentencing project, thank you very much for the role that the historic role that you in the organization have played. We're going to now hear from Kemba. Kemba Smith. Kemba has been referred to as the poster child of the war on drugs, receiving a 24.5-year sentence for drug conspiracy. There you go. It's even the name of a book, you know, poster child. Kemba, can you also, along with Lawrence and others, with some of those early on that really became spokespeople and advocates with respect to these issues, can you share for us your reflection with respect to the war on drugs from your vantage point?
Good morning. Thank you, Nkechi. And I'm very honored to be on this panel with everyone here and this history of work. But from my vantage point, and it was interesting hearing Lawrence Garrison speak, and I just want to make it clear that, you know, us formerly incarcerated that have been doing this work, we do it out of passion, we do it out of wanting to change policy and laws, but it is quite difficult to go back to this place. But I do it because there are several that I left behind in prison, including my friend Michelle West, who's still serving a double life sentence, and I will continue to advocate for her release. But from my vantage point in 1994, when I turned myself in 7 months pregnant, I can remember sitting in the courtroom, and Lawrence brought back so many memories, because in the Eastern District of Virginia, I forgot about that rocket docket. But ultimately, there were supporters in the courtroom that testified to my character. There was expert testimony with regard to the domestic violence and abuse that occurred within the relationship that I was in, because basically I was a college student, got caught up in a relationship that typically women that get caught up in such situations such as that, you know, you may get a slap on the wrist or something like that. But when it came to this war on drugs, there was something called the girlfriend problem. And I know the ACLU and other organizations highlighted it, but ultimately I was sentenced to 24.5 years, which was actually longer than I had been living on this earth, because I was 23 at the time. And pregnant, scared to death. Never in a million years would have thought that I would have had this ordeal. But, you know, when you talk about pretrial and bail, the Eastern District didn't afford me the opportunity for bail. So I ended up giving birth to my son while I was incarcerated. You know, leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed. But I thank God for my parents, just like Queen Karen Garrison. My parents were out on the forefront, letting people know about my ordeal. Worked with Eric and Marc and you, Nkechi, and several other organizations in the past. But after I gave birth to my son, that's when I was sentenced to 24.5 years in federal prison. And shortly after going to federal prison, which they sent me to a prison over 2,000 miles away from home, my parents were able to come visit. And then later I put in a hardship to be transferred to Danbury, Connecticut. And because of time, I'm going to try to speed through this, but there was a magazine called Emerge Magazine. And I thank God for the Black news media, because they were the ones that took on my story. They didn't care about putting a famous person's face on the magazine. They wanted to highlight this issue of the war on drugs. And because of that publication, basically the NAACP Legal Defense Fund decided that they were going to take on my case pro bono, which was historic for that organization to take on a case like mine. And Elaine Jones, that connection was, she was from Norfolk, Virginia, and was the first Black woman graduate from UVA's law school. And so she told me she was going to make sure my case saw justice. And we went through Norfolk court system. They denied every motion we submitted because the attorney that I had in the past said that he was willing to testify to his ineffective assistance of counsel, because basically he was friends with the prosecutor, and the prosecutor had promised that if I pled guilty, I would only get 24 months in prison. And he also said if I turned myself in, I would be granted a bond. But because of Emerge taking on the article, Elaine Jones, there were several organizations that came on board, such as FAM, the ACLU, the Advancement Project, and I cannot be remiss and forget my congressman, Congressman Bobby Scott, that actually came into the facility to let me know that he was going to make sure my case saw justice. But it wasn't about just me, it was about the fastest growing population within prison were Black women. And so these organizations that come together hoping that my case would set a precedent for other people to get some type of relief. But unfortunately, I couldn't get relief through the court. So my only opportunity to get relief was through executive clemency. So the same president that signed this crime bill was the same president that signed my commutation. And in December 2000, I was released from federal prison after serving 6.5 years. And so after my release, I was determined that I wasn't going to walk away, that I wanted to continue to be a human face for this issue, even though I was on probation and had one of the strictest probation officers in the Eastern District. And he basically monitored my speeches and what I said, but I made sure that what I said was the truth. And I continue to advocate. So I thank God for you, Nkechi, also Deborah Small. There were several people that came together. But in this work, just I know you've given me the wrap up. I have my foundation that focus on educating youth about particular issues. I'm on the board of Drug Policy Alliance now. I'm also working on a movie. But in that movie, it's important for us in this work to continue to change the narrative. And I think regardless if we're talking about the war on drugs or just mass incarceration in general. So I hope that my story can do that, but I also have to, in closing, shout out my other sisters that have encouraged me along the way. Amy Pofall, Andrea James, Susan Burton, Deanna Hoskins. It's just amazing the work that we've been able to do since we've been released from federal prison. And just thank you and the organizations that have supported us throughout this process. Thank you, Nkechi.
Thank you very much, Kemba. And yes, we must call their names. Thank you for doing that. And we must change the narrative. And I'm just so proud and just so thrilled with just the vast numbers of directly impacted people who are taking their seat at the table, rightfully where it should be and where it should always be, and are helping that very critical goal of changing the narrative. So to round out our first panel, oh, you all just don't know what pleasure it brings me to bring up William Underwood. William Underwood, survivor of 33 years in prison. You know, William, if you can just share with the Justice Roundtable whatever you want to share in 3 to 5 minutes with respect to your involvement in the war on drugs, what you plan to do now as an activist, now that you are out here, you've been out for 4 months or something along those lines, but just, reflect back with respect to war on drugs. William Underwood, and take yourself off of mute.
Okay, I'm off mute now. Okay. God bless Karen and Kemba and Marc, Eric, and of course, Nkechi. Without you, I wouldn't be home. You, my children. But like Kemba and Lawrence said, we all suffer from some form of survivor's remorse because there are so many good people that shouldn't be in this situation. Me, myself, my case is different. I was involved in criminal activity growing up, but I transitioned to other things. And, the Southern District in New York is unforgiving. And they wouldn't allow me to transition to other things. And of course, this whole system is predicated on, forget about justice, there is none. They want you, Black men, Black women, to come before them and say you're sorry and you're remorseful, but it's not my fault. He did it over there, and he did it, and they did it, and they told me to do it. And if you do that, like Lawrence alluded to, in the federal system, it's called get down first. If you do that, then you go home. If you involve other people, if you bring misery on families, you go home. When you decide to go to trial, under the perception that you're an American citizen, you pay the price of going up against the United States government, not because you're an American citizen, but because you have the unmitigated gall to stand up under the Bill of Rights, something that your ancestors fought for, your ancestors suffered for, your ancestors died for. You have the unmitigated gall to want to stand before a jury of your peers, which they never are, and for them to determine your guilt or innocence. And the kicker in all this is that no matter what the witnesses say, because in federal court, you learn something different. You learn that what the witnesses say on the stand is evidence. You learn in the final moments before your demise that what the lawyers say is not evidence. What the witnesses say is evidence. And when the judge charges the jury, the jurors have to go back in their minds and listen to what the witness said. No matter how insane it is, no matter how unbelievable it is, no matter any of those things. And of course, some of the witnesses, they carry the authority of the government with them because they're federal agents and this. And now, no matter how obtuse the story is, when the judge charges the jury, she or he says what the witnesses say is evidence. And that's where they crush you at. And you have no remorse for that or no comeback. Now, ironically for me, during my trial, they stopped the trial and gave me a special hearing because, again, and I'm going to make this short, I made a Sixth Amendment challenge to the application of the federal sentencing guidelines. My case goes back a little further than the 90s. I was sentenced under the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which went into effect November 1st, 1987. And it was the beginning of the mandatory minimums. And after they sentenced me, the judge used, because I made this objection and they stopped the trial and gave me a special hearing, she used a case to justify her position called Macmillan versus Pennsylvania. And it was decided in 1986. It was a 5-year gun sentence out of the state of Pennsylvania, but it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in that decision, they mentioned sentencing factors, and this is a term that will live in infamy because it meant that a judge could find anything from anywhere and determine by a preponderance of evidence. And the preponderance of the evidence standard is a civil standard. It's for civil trials. It's not for criminal trials. When you elect to go to trial, you're supposed to have a jury of your peers find you guilty of all elements of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. That never happens for people of color. That never happens. And it's never going to happen. That's the reality that we live in, you know. So this Macmillan versus Pennsylvania, I objected to it, and I've objected all the way around and objected in the PSI, and every federal prisoner knows what that is, or federal activist. And I objected at sentencing, I objected on my direct appeal, and I objected on my first 2255. And the rule of law, because they like to use this term, you hear this a decade after decade, administration after administration of the rule of law. Well, the rule of law says if you make a constitutional objection at the proper moment in a civil or criminal case, or if you fail to make a constitutional objection, if you fail to make a constitutional objection at the proper moment in a civil or criminal case, then you forfeit the right to ever bring it again. But my case was completely the opposite, because at every avenue along the way, every time I had the opportunity in the proceedings, I made the constitutional objection. So when I did that, it became a comedy of errors. Then what's the remedy for someone who's made this constitutional objection that you all love to quote as this rule of law? What is the remedy when you make the constitutional objection at every phase of the proceedings? Well, sorry, we don't know. And while you objected to everything, the irony is I sat for 20 years longer than I was supposed to. And that's fine. That's fine. Because they said, well, it's not retroactive. Mm-hmm. Well, the retroactivity was never the issue. The reality is that every part of the sentencing guidelines that you people work to dismantle, every case, every statute, 18 U.S.C. 3553B1 and 18 U.S.C. 3742E that was thrown out of the window. They use religious terms. I know I have to wrap up, but they use religious terms and excise and severing. They called it excise and severed, 18 U.S.C. and 3553B1 from the guidelines. And if they hadn't done that, then every guideline would have been unconstitutional. Okay, the child predator guidelines and every other would have been unconstitutional. So instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, they excised and severed those two provisions. Well, those two provisions were cited against me. So when I saw this stuff begin to dismantle, okay, I knew eventually if I lived long enough, they were going to have to let me go. You know, but the irony of the war on drugs, it could all end tomorrow if we all work towards amending the United States Constitution. And that's not an impossible task. It's a hard task, but it's not an impossible task because they've done it before. They did it for alcohol. They did it. They do it all the time when they want to, that's what we have to. That's what we have to work towards. That's what we have to work towards. Dismantling this mandatory minimums, this, that, and the other. No, amend the Constitution to reflect the times and circumstances of age-old statutes and that we don't, that is no longer no use for in society. 50 years is long enough. Y'all say the war on your 50 years, but in doing that, they'd have to find something else for the Drug Enforcement Administration and the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms to do. This is really it's a comedy of errors.
And
to sit here and talk about a war of drugs.
We really need to do something about these age-old statutes.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask the Justice Roundtable to just stay tuned, because they're going to be hearing a whole lot more from you, Bill Underwood. So thank you very much. We do have another panel that is about to come up, so we'll make sure we have a time for all that. But I really want to thank everyone. Everybody said, thank you for your service. Thank you. I really thank you for your lives and for the energy that you were put in all of these years, all of these decades with respect to fighting against the war on drugs. And at this point, I want to bring to the stage Cynthia Roseberry, who's going to moderate our second panel. And if you just give me one moment so I can bring folk up, and I'm going to replace stoplights, remove stoplights. Just hold on one second. Okay. Cynthia, welcome.
Thank you, Nkechi.
And I'm going to bring up your panel. Okay. Oh my goodness. Great. Cynthia, thank you so very much. So, panel 2 is titled Justice Roundtable Moves Forward. Okay. We did our look back, and we're going to be moving forward now, featuring some of the working group leaders. And I'm going to bring up your panel right now so that you can introduce them. Let's see. Add spotlight, Grant, add spotlight, Chrissy. And spotlight Kanya. Hold on. Okay, I don't even see your spotlight, Kanya. Here we are. Okay, I think I'm missing Jenny and Kara. Do I have everybody?
You do.
Okay, great. Cynthia, turn it over to you. Cynthia is Deputy Director of the Justice Programs of the ACLU, and she also co-chairs our clemency working group. So Cynthia, take it away, and I'm going to remove myself from this panel.
Thank you, Nkechi. And, we have to stop to thank you. Everybody who speaks can call Nkechi Taifa's name. So we have to take a moment to acknowledge the amazing and tremendous work that she's doing. I'm so honored to be moderating this incredible panel. I think I can call you all my friends. I certainly call you my colleagues, but I know I call you my heroes and sheroes. We have Kristina Roth and Kanya Bennet, Grant Smith, Kara Gotsch, and Jenny Collier. And as Nkechi mentioned, the question for panel 2 is, from the vantage point of your Justice Roundtable working group, what bold actions need to be taken to help bring an end to the war on drugs? We know the war on drugs has caused so many problems. So I'm going to start with Kristina Roth, and I'll introduce each of you as we move through the panel. Kristina is with Amnesty International. She co-chairs the Justice Roundtable's Law Enforcement Reform Working Group. And Kristina, in 3 to 5 minutes, share with us your working group's vantage point. What are some of the bold actions that need to be taken to help bring an end to the war on drugs?
Well, thanks so much, Cynthia. And of course, you all can always call me Chrissy, but yes, my name is Kristina. Just in the press, pretty much, though. So I appreciate the question and the opportunity we have on this anniversary to share about the solutions that the working group is seeking with regard to addressing the war on drugs, which has contributed to a growth in aggression and the militarization of policing, from discriminatory stop and frisk practices to the execution of narcotics warrants. There's been a number of policing reforms that the groups around the Justice Roundtable's Law Enforcement Reform Working Group have advocated for changes to, and both an end to as well. Some certainly big ones come to mind that I'll speak briefly on, but the working group has remained particularly focused on addressing demilitarization of law enforcement, with its sights set to end the 1033 program, which was instituted in 1990. The transfer of decommissioned or surplus military equipment to state and local federal law enforcement. The public has responded to this excessive use of this violent equipment, particularly over the summer, as we saw it used to address largely peaceful protests during the killing, response to the killing of George Floyd and too many others last year by law enforcement. But we also know that this equipment has been used for the enforcement of drug laws as well in the execution of these warrants. The 1033 program has been notoriously mismanaged, and in 2017, a GAO report found that the program could not prevent fraudulent applications from acquiring weapons of war from the program. A recent report from Cynthia, the ACLU, with the ACLU, noted that since 2011, transfers from the US military and local law enforcement have averaged $390 million a year that have been distributed to more than 6,500 local and state agencies, all 50 states and territories. And while I'm tasked to share about what we can do to prevent future harms of policing caused by the war on drugs, it is now more than ever abundantly clear that the 1033 program must come to an end. And along these lines, earlier this year, a group of about 5 organizations, including the ACLU, Drug Policy Alliance, Amnesty International, and those with the National Criminal Defense Fund, also wrote a letter to the administration calling early days of the administration that they put an end to this program. We know that the president has the authority to put a moratorium on this program, and we wrote him in the early days of the administration saying, place a moratorium on this program and work with Congress to end it. As Congress is deeply considering the Justice in Policing Act, this maintains an ask that the working group has had, as in the letters we've sent to Congress and advocacy that we've done. And through that process, we've also seen as well a real shift over the years from what had been support for legislation that would certainly limit the program in the ways of the Obama-Biden executive order to something that's more aggressive than that. We know now through multiple reporting that the program is not going to do any good. And this year, just last month, 155 groups signed a letter to Congress supporting the introduction of Congresswoman Nydia Vasquez's bill to put a complete end to the program. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be consistent in this ask. I think it's important in this moment to take stock of, an ask that we had over many years that has evolved into something that we now know is going to be more effective. And so putting an end to the 1033 program is among those top recommendations we have, certainly as we are, also faced with what the Justice in Policing Act may or may not do. There is a conversation active about addressing no-knock warrants. I think it's important that we not just address whether the warrants are a no-knock or a quick knock, whatever, all of those things are of course bad, but there's a larger conversation to be had about the issuance of warrants with regard to narcotic warrants being served in the first place. Should they be served? And we certainly, over the past year, have seen a lot of examples, one strikingly of a woman in Chicago who, police came into her apartment while she was naked to try to serve a warrant, and they were, ostensibly in the wrong place, right? So we've seen more than enough examples that have gotten public attention as to the dangers of this process. And so we'll also look forward to addressing that part of the system as well. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Thank you for correcting me on that and allowing me to call you Chrissy in this forum. We're going to move now to Kanya Bennet. There are not enough accolades for me to attach to Kanya Bennet. She's my former colleague at the ACLU. And when I first got there, she took me by the hand and helped me not make some critical mistakes. So I'm forever indebted to her. She's so committed. She's now with the Bail Project, and she also co-chairs the Justice Roundtable's pretrial and courts working group. Kanya, welcome, and share with us your working group's perspective on bold action.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that very warm welcome. And thank you, Nkechi and Cynthia, for convening this very important conversation upon the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's pronouncement of the war on drugs. And thank you to the earlier panelists who shared their stories, Queen Karen and Kemba and Mr. Underwood and Marc and Eric. That was a really tough panel to hear. And honestly, I'm still really reflecting on the stories, the narratives that were conveyed. They really put a human face to this trauma, this tragedy of the failed drug war. But this is why we do the work. And so with these stories, we move forward, understanding the human impact to do the work of systems change in the criminal legal system. And that's really what is required of us. As Cynthia shared, I'm Kanya Bennet. I'm with the Bail Project, doing the policy work that is critical in the bail and pretrial space. And as one of the chairs of the Pretrial and Courts Reform Working Group, there are several bold actions that we can take to help bring an end to the war on drugs. And one of those actions includes ending cash bail to dramatically reduce the pretrial jail population at the local level. And another one of those actions includes eliminating the presumptions of detention for drug offenses at the federal level. And to be clear, to truly end the war on drugs, to not just band-aid the wound, these fixes must occur along with other systems change work that divest from criminalization and invest in community and reimagines public safety. There are 500,000 people in jail awaiting trial, and the majority are there because they cannot afford bail. 120,000 people, or 1 out of 5 of this pretrial population, have been charged with a drug offense. From jail, people convicted of drug offenses will go on to account for almost 500,000 of the 2 million total prison population. And at the federal level, where about 50% of the prison population has been convicted of drug offenses, not surprisingly, those charged with drug crimes end up being detained pretrial in 2/3 of federal cases. That's about 22,000 people who are being held in pretrial detention in federal jails for drug crimes. And at the federal level, the average person there will spend 255 days in pretrial detention without having been convicted of a crime. This presumption of detention for drug offenses at the federal level is a result of the 1984 Bail Reform Act at the federal level, and that was used to help carry out the drug war. And as you heard Kemba share her story, it's the drug offense that matters. There is no reflection on the person. There is no consideration of humanity here that would allow a person who is pregnant to be detained pre-trial for this drug offense. And just as the war on drugs disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people, as again, we heard from our panelists today, as we heard from Kemba, as we heard from Queen Karen, as we heard from Mr. Underwood, Black and Brown people are going to be part of those disparities at the pretrial stage as well. We know that Black and Brown people account for 50% of the pretrial population nationwide. And we also know that if you are Black or Latinx, a judge is likely to set a bail amount twice as high as the average bail set for a white person. And so these statistics really demonstrate that pretrial detention for those charged with drug offenses is a driver of mass incarceration. And if the goal is to stop drug offenses and drug use, it is clear that continued criminalization of drugs, which instigates pretrial detention and cash bail, is not the solution. If substance use treatment is a needed outcome, jailing someone pending the disposition of their case is not the right response. Instead, what is needed is investment in people, investment in community. We need community release with support, which is a vision of pretrial justice that preserves the presumption of innocence and responds to people's needs with respect and dignity. In this instance, we return people to communities pre-trial, to their families, to their friends, their employment, their education, their housing, to voluntary substance use treatment if that is what is needed, to ensure that someone returns to court. Again, it is investments in people and their humanity in communities that determines whether or not someone returns to court, not cash bail. And we know that there are better case outcomes for people who are not detained pre-trial. At the Bail Project, where we are doing direct service work, we know that 40% of our clients have their cases entirely dismissed, and less than 10% spend additional days in jail when they are not detained pre-trial. So what do we do? How do we move forward? So we know that the federal government, which declared this war on drugs, can use its pulpit to end cash bail at the state and local level. We know that with funding and other resources, there is a national platform that the federal government has to own. They can model the systems change we seek, and again, can give resources to states and localities that want to do that as well. And we are seeing some of that in legislation that has been introduced in Congress. And then we know that the federal government also needs to clean its own house, and that they need to eliminate this blanket presumption of pretrial detention for pretrial detention for federal drug offenses with reforms to the '84 Bail Reform Act. And we also have legislation that's been introduced that serves as a starting point for that. And so we know that there is, again, a lot of work that needs to happen to declare an end to this failed drug war, and that addressing what is happening at the bail and pre-trial stages is just one piece of systems change work that we all need to do together. So again, really want to thank Nkechi for having the vision, as she always does, for having us look back, having us look forward, have us consider this important conversation on this anniversary. And of course, Cynthia, thank you for so skillfully moderating this panel. So I look forward to hearing what the other colleagues want to share.
Thank you, Kanya. Always so kind, always so generous. Grant Smith is next. He's with the Drug Policy Alliance, and he chairs the Justice Roundtable's Drug Policy Working Group. Grant, in 3 to 5 minutes, what's your take?
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. And it's good to be with y'all today, this afternoon over on the East Coast. It's such a privilege and honor to co-chair the Drug Policy Reform Working Group along with Mel Wilson. Y'all know that we revived the working group in January. And when we did so, we were thinking about how we're going to end this drug war, right? We've been going on at this for 50 years. And what is missing from the Justice Roundtable? There's a lot of terrific work happening on the Justice Roundtable, right? In terms of sentencing reform, reentry work, law enforcement reform, you name it. But there wasn't a lot of work happening that really sort of addressed the humanity of people who use drugs, the humanity of people who are on the margins, who are struggling, suffering, but whose humanity lawmakers were exploiting, right? Exploiting the fear, the mythology around these substances, and people who use drugs to perpetuate the war on drugs. And so when Mel and I got together and discussed a vision for this working group, we looked at the unprecedented overdose crisis that's been largely ignored, right? We looked at how Congress is reacting to substances like fentanyl-related substances, right? And sort of pulling out the same drug war playbook out for that. We looked at the fact that there are billions of dollars going to law enforcement and incarceration, but very little funding for programs that actually save lives, like harm reduction programs. And we wanted to kind of create space within this working group to help, advance policies and political support for, that will actually protect the health and welfare of people who use drugs, actually humanize people who use drugs. And we think, and I think that is a core need to actually end the war on drugs. Along with sort of challenging myths and assumptions about people who use drugs, and really sort of humanizing individuals who use drugs and even sell drugs, we need to be thinking about stigma, right? At the core of the war on drugs is the perpetuation of stigma, and stigma, society, stigmatizes behavior by criminalizing it. And Kanya mentioned earlier that it's critical, right, that we look at decriminalizing drugs We cannot eliminate stigma, which perpetuates a lot of these policies, until we decriminalize drugs and take law enforcement completely out of drug policy. And so that's a goal of the working group, and it's a goal that I think is critical to seeing a final end to this war on drugs. We have to continue working on sentencing reform and these other pieces, but we have to get at the core of what's driving the stigma and perpetuating it. And, I think, along with this, it's really critical that as part of the drug policy reform working group, it's a goal for Mel and I, but also in terms of our broader work, that people who with lived experience and people who use drugs are at the center of that advocacy. They're on the Hill, they're meeting with policymakers, they are redefining what it means to be someone who's affected by substance use disorder, someone who uses drugs. I think that kind of work is going to be critical to not only working towards eliminating criminal penalties for drugs, but also eroding support for prohibitionist attitudes and policies that have persisted despite decades now of drug prohibition. It's going to be critical that we have people with lived experience and advocates, working, educating in order to stop the cycle of applying these same old sort of drug war tactics that we've seen with most recently with fentanyl-related substances, for instance. We have to move beyond that. And, I would say it's also critical that we really ensure that we stop weaponizing addiction, and we hold policymakers accountable for that. As I said, there's, I think, we're seeing a lot of efforts to exploit legitimate concern about overdose deaths, and to push for more police and more incarceration rather than policies that support harm reduction and treatment. And that's something we have to address at its core. We have to really move away from law enforcement and towards treatment and harm reduction. And I think, it's critical we do this because, every time we see this happen, whether it's with fentanyl or another drug, emerging drug, novel drug, what have you, it's Black and brown communities that are disproportionately harmed. And of course, all communities are harmed by these policies. And these types of policies that criminalize and increase incarceration only exacerbate the harms associated with drugs. They don't reduce the harms. And so, the goal here, I think a goal here in terms of ending the drug war is, of course, eliminating criminal penalties for drugs, humanizing people who use drugs in the eyes of policymakers, redefining what it means to have a substance use disorder, to use drugs, to even sell drugs. And I think, if we can do that, we can help craft policy that will actually save lives. And I think it's critical that we move to a place where people who use drugs and people who've lived experience are at the table with policymakers, drafting this legislation, crafting it in ways that will actually result in policies that save lives and policies that don't reflect the war on drugs we have today. And so, in short, that's sort of some thoughts I have about what needs to happen to get us to a place where we can actually say the war on drugs is history.
Thank you so much, Grant, for that insight. I'm moving next to Jenny Collier, the Collier Collective. Whenever I need to know anything, Jenny Collier is the person I go to. She co-chairs the Justice Roundtable's Reentry Working Group. Jenny, what is Reentry's perspective for bold action to help bring an end to the war on drugs?
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that incredibly warm greeting and kind words. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm really grateful to you, my colleagues, and especially Nkechi for having this discussion today at the convening. It's really important to be doing this, and everyone's presentations have been incredibly important and have made me incredibly mindful. As Kanya said, I'm still reflecting. I want to echo some of what Grant said, I think, in the theme of, we need to commit to making people-focused decisions, and impacted people leading our advocacy will ensure that we stay focused on people and their families. And in this case, people using drugs or their families. And so that's really, I think, for us in the Reentry Working Group, we've been thinking a lot about how to make sure to keep a people-focused perspective. I also just want to mention, the generational nature of the Justice Roundtable that we're witnessing today. The leaders you've heard from on the first panel were role models and people who formed the advocacy that I did much earlier in my career, 25 years ago, when I came to DC and really started to do things like Justice Roundtable advocacy when it started. And it's been so critical that the Justice Roundtable is still leading and recruiting new and often younger members, both individuals and organizations, so that our advocacy can actually evolve and be responsive to the current needs, as I think we were just talking about, continuing the destigmatization of this issue and the people who are impacted by it, and really have them lead that work. And so, I want to also echo, as somebody who's not just a legal and legislative advocate, but who's somebody who's worked in public health and has been a public health system changer, the fact that one of the first things we need to do right now is keep people alive. We have two incredibly major and historic epidemics happening in the US right now: the COVID-19 epidemic, which has impacted everybody, but also the drug overdose epidemic. For COVID-19, the Justice Roundtable has been asking to decarcerate people and keep as many people out as possible. And, there have been varying results to those calls nationwide. It's been incredibly critical. But also at the same time, all of that was happening, we saw a massive spike in overdose in the United States. It's estimated that 100,000 people will have died in 2020 from overdose. That's almost a quarter of the number of people, probably closer now to 20% of the number of people who've died of COVID-19. And overdose is increasing among Black people and Latinx people, often at greater rates in places like California. And it's something that just is going highly underreported. And people are not focusing on this like they need to. And for us, reentry starts from the first day that you go into the system. And so it's really important that we make access to harm reduction services as well as other services that people need, medical services, support services. They start inside carceral settings, as well as upon reentry into the community. And, it's specific things like expanding access to medication-assisted treatment inside the walls and outside, safe syringe services programs, safe consumption programs in communities, medical care. We've been working on passing the Medicaid Reentry Act for several years and are getting the closest that we've gotten, hopefully, in this next reconciliation package, so that people who are incarcerated 30 days before their release have access to Medicaid. And that would be many, many people across the nation who are incarcerated who would be able to access care that way. We also, though, need to promote that people-centered, holistic reentry that we've heard a lot more about, especially, I think, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Representative Karen Bass from California introduced the One-Stop Shop reentry bill that really, and had a hearing about it last year, that really kind of focused on community-based reentry services. Organizations such as Safer Foundation of Chicago have been doing this for 50 years, but, we really need to make it so that we're not just funding reentry, but we're removing barriers to reentry, right? We're making it easy for people to reenter. We're coordinating our services under the same house if we can. We're removing those barriers to, transportation barriers, financial barriers, access barriers, referral barriers. People need to be able to get to the services that they need to not only support their own individual reentry, but often to be able to operate in the community and to help support their families and be reunited with families. And then finally, we really need to end collateral consequences. We've been talking about this for decades at the Justice Roundtable. Finally, after 25 years, as long as I've been working in this field, Congress lifted the ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated students last year. Major achievement. Congratulations to all the people who've worked on that issue. But I think that created now momentum that we can use and leverage to push Congress and the administration to address and prevent other collateral consequences, including the SNAP TANF ban on people with drug felony convictions, specifically from accessing those services that has not been fully lifted in still several states, or whose modified versions need to be fully lifted. Voting rights, which the Entry Working Group has just reinvigorated through Breon Wells and other many people he's brought to the table, many directly impacted people, to talk about voting rights. That's been part of the Reentry Working Group's more recent focus. Housing access, etc. It goes on and on and on and on. We find collateral consequences, old and new, popping up all the time. And we really need to make sure that we're destigmatizing this issue, that we're pointing out that people are human beings. They are not criminal records. They are not categories of crime, violent versus nonviolent. We need to have auto expungement and sealing of crime so that people can fully re-enter and again, be able to partake in community as citizens. And so I just, those are very thematic in nature. They're literally dozens and dozens of policies that fall under those categories. The Reentry Working Group is our most diverse working group, I think, because it has people from public health, faith, directly impacted people, youth, housing, poverty reduction organizations. And so we work with, literally probably 5 to 10 committees, depending on the Congress. So we're always out there trying to bring as many people to the table as possible. And so I'm, I want to wrap it up there, but I really appreciate you allowing, us to add our more diverse perspective and really want to continue the legacy of the Justice Roundtable and its many leaders to, push this issue. I think we have a very unique time right now to try to take advantage of, and that we should work as hard as ever. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for all your good work. Kara Gotsch is last but certainly not least. This woman, I have no idea how she does everything that she does. If you knew her daily schedule, it would blow your mind. She's with the Sentencing Project. Kara co-chairs the Justice Roundtable Sentencing Reform Working Group. Kara, tell us about, if there's ever a time for boldness in sentencing, it's right now. So we're longing to hear from you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Nkechi, and everyone who's spoken today. I admire all of you and have really been taking in everyone's thoughts, and it's totally consumed my mind about where to begin. There's so much work to do, and I know at times it can seem overwhelming, but all of us working together, this epitomizes sort of the challenges in front of us, really epitomize why the Justice Roundtable is so critical, and the contributions of its participants and members is so important, because there's so much work to be done, so much policy, so much injustice to overcome, and all of our voices are so critical and important to accomplishing our goals. And so thank you for allowing me to be part of this wonderful community of people. It has been the highlight of my career in criminal justice reform, working with all of you beautiful people. And I say that with all sincerity, because it really does make the work so much more meaningful and impactful when we all work together and come together in our achieving our goals. So I wanted to also talk about, I really appreciated what Grant in particular had to say. I want to say how important the Drug Policy Alliance really has been to the work of ending the drug war. I've learned so much over the years from the Drug Policy Alliance that a lot of this conversation, I realize I'm going to be talking about drug sentencing policy, but a lot of this conversation should not be around drugs and substance use disorders. We should not be having this conversation in the Justice Roundtable, right? This is about health and protecting people's well-being. And they have really done amazing work in really shifting the narrative around drugs and people who use drugs. And now my sort of orientation is completely different. And I want to thank them for that and remind all of us that this really is about protecting people's health and making sure people are well, and it shouldn't be about the criminal justice system. That being said, drug policy infects the federal criminal justice system overwhelmingly. As Kanya mentioned, half the people in federal prison are there because they've been convicted of a drug offense. Half the people serving life without parole in the federal prison system are there because of a drug offense. Now, if you look at state systems, right, who do we put in prison at the state level? What kind of sentences they have? The brutality and the excessiveness of the federal system and how it sentences people for drugs is not consistent at the federal, it's not necessarily true at the state level. Half the people, about 15% of the people incarcerated at the state level are there for drugs. 50% at the federal level are there for drugs. So drug policy has predominated much of the work for years and years around sentencing. And unfortunately, there's another an important touchstone around drug policy sentencing around drugs happened 35 years ago. And this is an unfortunate anniversary that had just occurred to me as I was sitting here, that on June 19th, Juneteenth, in 1986, that is the day that Len Bias died. And for folks who worked on drug sentencing policy reform for years know how important his death was in sparking what we now have and what Eric talked about, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. It created the 101 disparity. It created the extreme mandatory minimums that we have that are triggered simply by quantities of drugs, and why we have mass incarceration for people who've committed drug offenses, and this huge number of people in federal prison because of drug offenses. These Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, really harsh mandatory minimums created. Obviously, we know the rest of the story. So what I take light in now, so that's the past. Going forward, I am so emboldened by our colleagues in the Sentencing Reform Working Group who really did, in developing our agenda for this new Congress and this new administration, in the Transforming Justice recommendations, really took that on. And that was our agenda, to be bold, to transform the system. And I'm pleased that, among our top priorities was ending mandatory minimums, particularly for drug offenses. That is it's sort of really the first step in trying to dismantle and significantly reduce the population of people incarcerated for drug offenses at the federal level. The White House, in March, when they put out their proclamation, Second Chance Month proclamation, and I'm going to quote because I was shocked when I read it. Everyone knows in April is Second Chance Month. The White House put out their proclamation. Usually Second Chance Month is focused on reentry, but they included a sentence that said, supporting second chances requires eliminating exceedingly long sentences and mandatory minimums that keep people incarcerated longer than they should be. Amen. I see the charge of the Sentencing Reform Working Group is to make that reality happen. If we have a Biden White House and someone who has in many ways been an architect of the war on drugs and sentencing around it, calling for and eliminating mandatory minimums, I really would hope that we would expect nothing less from this Congress. We need to end mandatory minimums if we're seriously going to dismantle the harsh penalties that are associated with them. We also are supporting and prioritize in our recommendations the Second Look Act, which would provide relief to people who are currently incarcerated and serving long sentences. After 10 years, people could go before if passed, could go before a sentencing review committee and or a federal judge and make the case for why their sentence is no longer necessary based on public safety interests, based on the rehabilitation they've experienced while incarcerated, and petition for release. I think second chances and a second look at people's sentences is really critical. More incremental approaches are obviously on the agenda. I know many of our colleagues are prioritizing finally equalizing the disparity between crack and cocaine. I just think that's scratching the surface. We need to do so much more. I know that next week, the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to be considering legislation, the First Step Implementation Act. That includes important retroactive sentencing reforms that were included in the First Step Act for people who've committed drug offenses. That's something I think we definitely want to see happen. But the boldness that's really required is just ending mandatory minimums for drug offenses. And, I anticipate that will continue to be a priority for as long as until the Sentencing Reform Working Group is successful. So I just want to thank all of you, thank Nkechi Taifa and Amra Ahmed from the ACLU, who are my co-chairs. Without them, it would be too tiring to do. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Cara. Thanks, Grant, Chrissy, Kanya, Jenny as well. I'll turn the discussion back over to the inimitable leader of the Justice Roundtable, Nkechi Taifa.
Thank you so very much, Cynthia. Thank you, panel two, for your words and looking forward. And thank you, panel one. Thank you. Don't go anywhere, anyone. If you wish to stay for the very brief working group updates, we're going to bring folk up who plan to stay, from attendee to panelists, so this can be interactive. Lawrence Garrison on the tape spoke about the rocket docket in Virginia. Well, this is going to be a rocket docket with respect to our working group updates. Those who don't want to stay can just leave the Zoom, but I want to let everyone know that our next Justice Roundtable Assembly will be September the 8th, 2001. If you have any announcements, please put your announcements in the chat. Everyone can save the chat. And I'm going to ask my assistants, Lydia and Aforowa, if you can start moving people from attendee to our panelists, so that and if you want to take a few minutes, this is going to just take a few minutes to take care of personal needs. Now is the time to do it. But again, thank you for joining this June 2nd Assembly of the Justice Roundtable, featuring looking back and forward movement with respect to ending the war on drugs. This is Nkechi Taifa. Let's start elevating people. Thank you very much. Announcements in the chat, please.